The days of ancient Rome are often reflected on by historians as a time of significant political and cultural expansion, a civilization that laid the groundwork for many modern republics to come after it, including our own. But as with every ancient civilization, there were elements that many considered to be slightly less evolved than the customs of today, one of those being the famous spectacle of gladiatorial combat. At one point in time, gladiator fights were considered a cornerstone of Roman society, a form of entertainment for those who wished to see volunteers, slaves, and prisoners face off against one another in a variety of deadly and perilous challenges, drawing crowds in numbers that wouldn't be out of place at a Dallas Cowboys game. And I mean before they became a laughingstock. Yet the demise of Rome brought the demise of this form of entertainment. Nowadays, we see it constrained mostly within the realms of fantasy novels and pretentious YouTube intros. It seems that society collectively agreed that putting the poor and sick on a public stage for everyone to see and watching them fight for their dignity was, in its very nature, exploitative and inhumane. But did it ever really end? One man might beg to differ. This is the Jerry Springer Show, and this is Jerry Springer. On the 27th of April, 2023, he passed away at the age of 79. His death was met with reactions that reflected the complex nature of his legacy and the TV format he had long pioneered. But was this always going to be Jerry's legacy, or could his story have been vastly different to the one we know today? I intend to find out.
Well, it's known as the worst TV show of all time, asking ordinary people to confront their problems in explosive ways.
The Jerry Springer Show was the #1 talk show in daytime television. It actually beat Oprah Winfrey at its peak.
Hi, welcome to the show.
The wild world of Jerry Springer.
Because we show it does not constitute an endorsement of it.
And yet, it was a talk show where there was very little talking.
Outrageous knockdown, drag-out brawl.
Television does not and must not create values. It's merely a picture of all that's out there, the good, the bad, the ugly.
Where does it all come from?
Does this put the marriage in jeopardy?
Are you gonna give me my visitation shirts and my dog back, or what?
After the show, I got to thinking, why are these kids filled with hate?
The politicians or companies that seek to control what each of us may watch are far greater danger to America and our treasured freedom than any of our guests ever could or will be.
But you want to know what really pisses me off about this potential TikTok ban that could still very well happen? That you or I could go to any data broker's website right now and purchase somebody's personal data totally legally. It's a totally legal thing that you can go do right now. Big companies with poor security are getting hacked every day, and whether you like it or not, your personal information is being sold on the dark web, so spammers, scammers, and identity thieves can target you. And of course, they face zero repercussions for it. If the government can ban TikTok, what makes you think they're going to protect you from these similar practices? It's on us to protect ourselves, which is why I'm happy to partner with today's sponsor, Aura. Aura keeps me safe online by doing all of the hard work so I don't have to. They identify the data brokers selling my information and can submit opt-out requests on my behalf. Give Aura just a few weeks and you'll stop seeing your information on these sites when you search yourself. Aura will continuously monitor the dark web and alert me if they find my personal information exposed, letting me know instantly if anyone tries to use said information to access my credit or bank accounts. Plus, they give me up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst case scenario happen. Just click the link in the description box below or go to aura.com/jobry and get your first 14 days completely free, which is more than enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data has been exposed. Huge thanks again to the wonderful folks over at Aura for keeping us safe, but mostly sponsoring this video. Thanks for doing that. Gerald Norman Springer was born in 1944 at London's Highgate Station. His parents were Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, and 5 years later, his family would move to New York, where he would spend most of his childhood. From a young age, Springer seemed to take an interest in politics and law, pursuing both in the education system and taking up a position as a political aide to Robert F. Kennedy, the original Robert F. Kennedy, shortly before he was assassinated. In spite of his boss's untimely death, Springer remained active in local politics while also working at a law firm. In 1970, during a stint as director of the Ohio Youth Corps at the age of 26, he testified in front of the U.S. Senate on lowering the voting age.
My name's Jerry Springer, and I'm currently serving in the United States Army Reserve at Fort Knox, Kentucky. This past year, I served as chairman of the Cincinnati Committee to lower the voting age to 19. And despite the fact that the issue lost very narrowly in Ohio by somewhat less than 1% of the vote, we did manage to win in Hamilton County by over 10,000 votes. And I got to know, for over 3 months, many of the young people in that community become quite concerned about the issue.
This was the same year he also ran for Congress on a defiantly anti-war Democratic platform. He lost, but a year later, he would be elected to the Cincinnati City Council. This launched his career in politics. In fact, he quickly became well known amongst the electorate for his strong left-wing positions on abolishing the military draft, improving female representation in workplaces, advocating nuclear disarmament, focusing on rehabilitative justice, and emphasizing environmental protection. He endorsed left-wing candidate George McGovern during the primaries for the 1972 election and ascended the ranks quickly of the city council to vice mayor, with his own mayoralty set for 1975. And this time, he also became popular amongst voters for his unique political flair, partaking in various stunts, even being nominated for a local nightclub's Dad of the Year award, despite not being a father at the time. However, Springer's budding journey into politics came to a screeching halt in 1974 when he resigned for what was called at the time family reasons. But the real reason came to light shortly after, when a police raid of a bar in northern Kentucky revealed that Springer had paid a prostitute to have sex with him. The most incriminating evidence being he paid by check.
It is my fondest wish to re-enter public life, but I believe it in the best interest of this community that I resign until such time that the air has been cleared.
Springer voluntarily resigned his post from the council, but was re-elected the following year on the back of his popularity with the general public and an ad campaign that addressed the scandal head-on. It also helped that this was in the aftermath of a little impropriety called Watergate, so it wasn't like his opponents could really accuse him of anything worse than what old Tricky Dick had gotten up to. In 1977, Springer was selected for mayor, a role in which he served for 1 year.
Well, I think it's very important to have entertainment in the downtown area. If our only investment is in office buildings, then as soon as 5 o'clock comes, everybody goes home and our downtown will be empty. So the idea is to give people reasons to come on downtown.
During his tenure, he played a major role in Cincinnati's cultural renaissance, spearheading projects which sought to renovate the city's downtown area through the securing of urban development grants and overseeing various enrichment programs, such as a summer basketball league and Cincinnati's first ever rock concert, which was headlined by the Eagles. It was clear that Springer enjoyed the influence that such a position gave him, but he didn't like that it only lasted a year, which left many of his economic projects in limbo. In the time following his tenure, he continued to play the part of an eccentric lawmaker, fighting policy with the same enthusiasm he fought Victor the Wrestling Bear. But Mr. Gerald Springer's nagging desire to become a more influential figure in American politics never subsided. And with the 1982 gubernatorial election right around the corner and a healthy amount of time since his little bar trip, he figured, why not give it a shot?
Politicians spend a lot of time talking about and even chasing after German and Japanese companies. Sure, we need more industry, and I hope some of them will come. But what about our own businesses?
This wasn't the first time Springer had considered running for governor. After all, he had been tipped for lieutenant governor in 1978 and had also been looking at a congressional run. By now, it was apparent that the man was only really interested in running the show, and throughout the approach to the Democratic primaries, he ran a flurry of ads, selling himself as the Ohio populist who would support the people of his state above any corporate or political interest. He wanted people to know that he was a tireless fighter who would always speak truth to power, even releasing ads addressing his own scandals, using it as a testament to his transparency.
Some 9 years ago, I spent time with a woman I shouldn't have, and I paid her with a check. I wish I hadn't done that, and the truth is, I wish no one would ever know. But in the rough world of politics, opponents are not about to let personal embarrassments lay to rest. Perhaps like you, I'm not sure what any of this has to do with being governor, but maybe my talking to you about this makes a point. Ohio is in a world of hurt. The next governor is going to have to take some heavy risks and face some hard truths. I'm prepared to do that. This commercial should be proof. I'm not afraid, even of the truth, and even if it hurts.
It was undeniable that Springer's style of politics won him a lot of favor with the electorate. Only the scope of the task at hand ultimately proved too much for Springer. Although he had won the counties surrounding Cincinnati convincingly, he fell behind throughout the rest of the state to his opponents, who had both held office before. Basically, not enough people knew the name Jerry Springer, so he set out to change that. Throughout his time in politics, Springer had built up a reputation as a media-savvy communicator, and after the disappointment of 1982, he decided that his talents would be put to better use in front of the camera. In November of the same year, Springer took a job at Cincinnati's Channel 5 as a political commentator.
As a kid, did you ever, and you were watching the conventions, did you ever think there'd come a time when you would stand before the American people and say, Ohio cast its vote?
No.
What were you thinking about as a kid?
I was thinking that maybe you'd be doing it.
His big break wouldn't come until 1984. When Channel 5's ratings hit a rough patch, the former mayor was brought on as an anchor to provide a more charged look at the news, with the hope that it would pull the station out of its slump. The choice was met with skepticism from those who thought his energy would be antithetical to that which is expected of newsreaders. An article in the Cincinnati Post that year compared the task to treading water. Yet less than 5 years later, Channel 5's nightly news would top the local TV ratings, with much of the credit being handed to its leading anchorman, Jerry Springer.
Have you heard what Jerry Springer's been saying?
About the home state crisis.
It's enough to make any politician start thinking about life in the private sector.
On Cincinnati's residency law.
It's what an employee does while on the job that counts, not where he happens to bed down with his family at night.
On school prayer.
Well, it just doesn't matter. Those who want to pray will, those who don't, won't.
Jerry Springer's commentary on News 5 at 11. People make the difference.
Reports often noted how Springer tore up the formula for a traditional news anchor, the one that was objective and didn't allow personal sentiments to cloud how the information they were dealing with was being delivered. Springer would regularly make asides between stories, but most notably, his style of presentation was underscored by a closing monologue, one that allowed him to showcase an unfiltered perspective that was quintessentially his, and provide his personal insight on the day's affairs. Now, this approach to news wasn't uncontentious, and Channel 5, the organization, often made the local newspaper as much as the local news did. But Channel 5 did succeed in driving up ratings and proliferating the hosts as much as it did the stories it reported on, with Springer racking up multiple regional Emmy Awards, firmly establishing himself as a force to be reckoned with.
Indeed, after conflicting testimony as to whether or not he gave permission to sell arms to Iran in exchange for hostages, President Reagan now says he doesn't remember. Well, assuming he's telling the truth, that's no laughing matter. What other major items of foreign policy is he not remembering? And why isn't he writing it down so he won't forget? And what else is his staff keeping from him? By the way, who's running this country anyway?
As Springer's media presence continued to grow, WLWT began to explore how they could make the most of their popular figurehead. He'd worked before on other projects and documentaries for the channel, but the executives wanted something more durable. His specialty was politics, which was no surprise given he was a politician at one point, but the question remained as to how you could convert something as contentious and often dry as politics into a ratings-friendly format for your network.
She's smart. She's rich. She's unforgettable.
Oprah always knew that she was destined for bigger and better.
Well, come 1991, a genre known as tabloid talk shows were quickly growing in popularity, led by the inescapable Oprah Winfrey Show, who by this time was averaging approximately 12 million viewers per episode. Popularity aside, a talk show seemed like a good fit for our boy Gerald, as such shows tended to coast off the charisma and popularity of the host, something Springer was known to showcase regularly on Channel 5. People went to the news for Springer, so why wouldn't they follow him to his show that provided an even more concentrated version of his personality? In June of 1991, it was revealed that the executives over at WLWT were investigating the prospects of a TV show. And despite insisting that nothing was assured, by August they were already taping the show, with the debut date set for September 30th. It was said that the first season of Jerry Springer was going to be an attempt to tackle serious issues, with Springer's personality being the driving force behind the narratives, while featuring interviews with everyone from public figures to ordinary people. It would be concluded by his traditional closing commentary that many had come to know him for. In an interview, producer Bob Dubrow stated that in a saturated market full of TV talk shows, it was Springer's unique personality and maturity that was destined to set his program apart from the competition.
Right now, it's time for a new kind of talk.
You know, I love it when the audience starts out with one point of view, and then by the end of the show, they totally change their minds.
Right now, the talk you want is here.
If I'm going to ask people to bare their souls, I've got to bare mine, and I will, on every show.
Right now, you've got a real choice in talk.
Real talk, straight from the heart.
Jerry Springer, the right talk, right now.
These days, it's next to impossible to find any trace of the first few seasons. Even summaries seem to confuse them with later episodes. There's a common misconception today that the early seasons of Jerry Springer were a departure from most talk shows and strictly kept to political matters. However, topics of the first season included subjects that weren't exactly uncommon on talk shows at that time. Abusive relationships, sexual promiscuity, drug addiction, family tragedy, you know the drill, often given a flashy title that would draw in the casual viewer.
You've hit women, haven't you? You hit your women, don't you?
Only to shock them back to reality. You know?
Let that be a lesson. Nobody get away from reality.
Going off the summaries alone, this didn't feel particularly original, and if we're being honest, it wasn't. But returning to what Burt Dubrow said earlier, Springer had originally wanted to offer a more pragmatic and empathetic angle than many other talk shows that would seek to sensationalize their subjects. He'd even speak to the occasional high-profile public figure, interviewing famous Democratic politician Jesse Jackson and American Dad character Oliver North, which to nobody's surprise were Springer's favorite moments.
You knew when you were talking with the Iranians about getting the hostages back that is exactly what the President of the United States had said on television. We will not deal with the terrorists. He was telling other countries, please don't deal with the Iranians, don't deal with the terrorists.
Yeah, and even to this day, in his own memoirs, President Reagan says, we really didn't trade arms for hostages because we were dealing with the Iranians and the Iranians weren't the captors. Now, it's a distinction without a difference.
It was apparent that Springer wanted to take the subjects that were often given a heavy-handed treatment on TV and to approach them delicately and sensitively, and not, quote, in a trashy way. More on how that turned out a little later. While his mission seemed admirable, reception was mixed. Many were genuinely moved by Springer's handling of certain affairs, but others still felt that the subjects were too sleazy to actually warrant Springer's attention, and that the emotional weight of many of these stories diluted Springer's acerbic personality that they saw on the news.
If you just joined us, this is our first show, and we're putting together people who haven't seen each other for 35 years.
In Cincinnati, Springer debuted to some of the highest ratings ever seen by a local network. However, this gradually declined over the season. And in other cities where producers were testing the water, the reception seemed even cooler. Even in another Ohio city, Cleveland, the response from audiences was far from overwhelming. This wasn't exactly a surprise for a TV show debuting with a host who was an unknown to practically all of the country, but Jerry Springer couldn't afford to remain an unknown.
He's been living on the street since he was 9 years old when his father shot him in the stomach and left him for dead. On the streets of Hollywood, he's known as Tweaky Dave. He's now 19, a junkie, a former male prostitute, and he's dying from leukemia.
In 1992, his strong local ratings gave networks the confidence to make his series part of a $75 million sale to NBC alongside two far more popular shows at the time, Donahue and Sally Jesse Raphael. This deal would mean national distribution of the show and a studio move to Chicago, all of which would ensure more syndication for Springer and his self-titled program. The second season debuted in 1992, and although ratings were a strong improvement from the year before, with more consistent viewership throughout the country, there were signs that maybe this was beginning to take a toll on Springer's credibility with audiences. Although Springer's MO sought to introduce a veneer of seriousness to the tabloid subjects that many shows addressed in the time, the subjects themselves, which seemed to be venturing further into the provocative, were met by many with disapproval. At the time of the second season, Springer still had his newsreading job at Channel 5, but ratings appeared to be slipping there as well, with some theorizing that his association with the talk show industry were interfering with people's ability to take him seriously as a news anchor. And in January of the following year, he finally stood down from his role at WLWT to focus solely on the Jerry Springer Show.
We are back with grown-ups who like to act like babies, wear diapers, drink out of milk bottles.
He still defended the presentation of his talk show, stating that a majority of the episodes weren't actually remotely sleazy and that it was just TV clickbait in an attempt to lure viewership. It's hard to say how accurate this was, because reception was still mixed, and although many were quick to highlight Springer's more placid personality, some felt that it mostly took a back seat to the antics on the show. Springer, whose personality could at one point light up Cincinnati, now often felt part of the scenery in his own show. The only standout element was the closing monologue, which many would not have been around to see if they'd already switched off. And switching off, they apparently were.
You're up on stage. What do you do on stage that gets
I might
people...
go out and kick somebody in the head. I might grab a girl and force her to perform oral sex with me. I've had sex on stage with men, women, and animals, and everything in between. See, the thing of it is, in rock and roll, there can be no limits or no laws, because when you start drawing laws and limits, then you might as well not even call it rock and roll anymore. You might as well sell out to the corporate government like it's already done.
It's not rock and roll. There's nothing to do with rock and roll.
On the surface, ratings of the Jerry Springer Show didn't draw too much attention from a world already inundated by talk shows. However, there were murmurings behind the scenes as to whether Springer's show could survive another year. At the start of 1994, in an article written in the Chillicothe Gazette, it was revealed that Springer was expecting to leave behind the tabloid topics entirely and focus instead on the real issues that were currently plaguing America, stating that, quote, "When we've done the hard issues, that's when ratings jump." As mentioned earlier, the commonly held belief that Jerry Springer's show started with sole focus on strictly political matters was not true. In many ways, Springer was covering topics that wouldn't have set him apart from much of the crowd. It was only his approach that did, and even that didn't feel personal enough to win over a lot of audiences. However, with the desire to change up the content, it seemed that Springer was finally going to embrace his political roots once more, and was finally going to use the show to make a positive change in the world, one that would allow him to embrace who he felt he truly was. But things didn't exactly pan out that way.
But before we talk to Mark, let's meet his wife.
all just read was Springer declared in early 1994 that he was going to make his show more serious and focus on the issues that matter. This was supported by then-producer Terry Murphy, who took on the role after Burt Dubrow, the show's original producer who had been promoted to senior vice president at the show's production company, Multimedia Entertainment. Though Murphy would depart the show in 1994 to go work on The Gordon Elliott Show, another tabloid talk show from someone I've never heard of, but apparently he's British, so that should tell you everything. Murphy's replacement, an up-and-coming impresario by the name of Richard Dominic, was informed of the Herculean task that awaited him, a ratings deficit he needed to turn around to save the show. Now, conflict and debauchery was nothing new to Springer, but the idea of intentionally manufacturing them was, and by May, the Jerry Springer who had committed to phasing out tabloid topics was nowhere to be found. With subjects that seemed just as provocative as ever, and with even more emphasis on the sleaze, in one episode he visits a nude dancing diner called Cafe Erotica and holds a debate over whether such places are appropriate. A debate that may have been served better if one side wasn't completely naked. Over the next following months, Jerry's topics attracted criticism from the media, who branded it tacky and irresponsible programming, especially for a daytime talk show which could be watched by anyone. Regardless, it appeared to work in retaining the ratings that secured the future of the show. In fact, with every passing month that Springer leaned into these subjects, he only seemed to attract more and more viewers. By mid-1995, he had gone from almost having his show canceled to besting contemporary Phil Donahue in the numbers game. But Springer's descent into the surreal and absurd had an adverse effect too, as it began to draw more and more backlash from audiences and networks alike.
I don't want to work on the streets. I want a place of my own. I want things of my own. And, you know, I just want to leave peacefully. I hope that we can, you know...
For starters, we would always be friends, but I wouldn't want you to leave this here game alone. You know, it's like this here. If somebody leaves this here game alone, you know, statistics has proven once they leave, you know, they have bad luck. I mean, it's just not right. You know, I'm talking about it's not right.
A May 1995 article revealed that some channels weren't planning to renew the show, and how others had already been pulling certain episodes off the air due to the increasingly vulgar and explicit nature of the content involved. Sure, there were other channels willing to pick up Jerry from any setbacks he may have experienced, but this still represented an overall increasing discomfort with the material Springer was showcasing on a daily basis. Although Springer repeatedly referenced the fact that these were people who were willing to present themselves on the show as a snapshot of America, it would be hard for even the most uncritical viewer to not kind of question the ethics of the content he was producing. I spoke about Tyler Oliveira last month and about this notion of poverty porn, how filming people going through struggle isn't actually substantive if you don't have anything to supplement it, and Springer was pretty much in the same lane at this point. Many of these episodes were so dedicated to conflict and tastelessness that any point that Springer may have tried to make in a closing monologue would just be lost amongst the rest of what people had just seen.
I wish we could be together, but there's an element that's distracting us from getting together intimately.
What is that?
Well, I'm not what I seem to be.
What are you?
It was little secret that Springer took a somewhat aloof stance on the morals surrounding what he had created, but at least in the past he had attempted to weave a narrative around current affairs which would leave viewers with something to chew on. That sincere desire to actually pursue content that may improve society was no longer there. He was just going through the motions day in and day out of creating a machine that would routinely drag its guests through the mud and excuse it as providing us all with a little insight. It seems shocking that a politician previously so preoccupied with matters like social justice wouldn't even consider the implications of such content, but maybe he did and just decided to push on regardless. Either way, in less than 2 years, Springer had once again turned his career around and was quickly becoming one of the most recognizable names in daytime TV, all by abandoning any sense of principle he may have had. The networks tried to temper the subject matters that were bothering certain audiences, but Springer and Dominic persisted in their pursuits, all the same, continuing to roam the seedy debauchery of America's underbelly. By 1997, the show was already staring down a reputation as one of the most notorious broadcasts in the country, but little did people know that it could actually get worse.
Welcome back. Today we are talking to Klan members to see if they will give up their racist beliefs. Well, my next guest says he's fighting mad over the things our guests today have been saying, and he's going to set them straight. That's what he wants to do. He's a controversial civil rights leader as well. He's the founder of the JDL, the Jewish Defense League, a very controversial organization. Here is Irv Rubin and his bodyguards, Al and Joseph.
In between season 6 and season 7 of his self-titled show, Jerry Springer decided that now that he had settled into his Chicago groove, he would find some additional part-time work, eyeing up a position at the Chicago-based television station WMAQ-TV, who were also affiliated with the Channel 5 banner that he had previously worked under in Cincinnati. Going off his prior performance in such a role, someone like Jerry Springer would be perfectly suitable for a commentary position at the local network, and his enlistment to the station was announced to great fanfare, with the promise of one of his iconic closing commentaries. And yet...
She walked away last night from her multi-million-dollar news anchor job. Carol Maureen, one of Chicago's most respected journalists, quit after learning that talk show host Jerry Springer would be joining her news team as a commentator. Springer is best known for his highly controversial and lowbrow subject matter.
Springer's appointment was met with widespread backlash from both the public and the profession alike, with many pointing towards his brand of trash TV as so far removed from any sense of journalistic integrity that his presence would be incompatible with the channel's values. Two high-profile anchors at the time, Carol Maureen and Ron Majors, both threatened to walk if his hiring was followed through on. Springer clapped back, calling their protests arrogant and implying that they should really be welcoming him because he's going to bring interest to the table.
I think his television shows are some of the worst that television has to offer. I made a decision that I could not share a news desk, introduce, or validate a Jerry Springer on a newscast that I believe tries very hard to do some decent work.
Shortly after Springer officially joined the news station, Maureen quit her lucrative contract, and protests against Springer's inclusion escalated even further. Springer attempted to perform his job in spite of all this, producing a commentary that defended his inclusion as a free speech issue, comparing his contributions to Nazi marches he permitted as mayor of Cincinnati, which I would argue isn't the best comparison he could have gone with there.
That this is the freedom we sought when we escaped to here. So we must never be a party to silencing any person or any point of view, no matter how despicable. If what is being said is nonsense or mean or spiteful or dangerous, or if the person uttering it is unworthy, let the words and ideas fall of their own merit in the free marketplace of ideas, not because they were silenced or denied a platform. My parents lost their parents and brothers and cousins to Hitler, and yet they still said, sign the permit. Let him march.
Nevertheless, Springer held his ground and fought his case to remain at the station, citing the many tragedies that his own family had been through and how important his voice could be, along with taking aim at Maureen for her resignation.
This elitist snobbery that only people who need an anchor's approval should be permitted to share the set is now being hidden in the self-righteous cries of journalistic integrity. Bull, and you can fill in the rest of that word. Please understand, we have no journalism in a free society unless we have commentary from all parts of the community. Look, I am sorry the anchor quit. I'm sorry she found it necessary this week to use me as a stepping stone to martyrdom. But as much as I detest the elitist snobbery on this issue, I would never, ever suggest that she doesn't have a place on our airwaves. She does. But here in America, the rest of us do too. I wish she could have met my dad.
You can see what he's trying to go for here, but it just doesn't really land. It feels antagonistic and unprofessional, and shortly after this, Ron Majors also resigned. With mounting pressure and spiraling ratings for the network, Springer's contract was canned after 2 commentaries, rendering those emotional appeals to his heritage and suffering sorely ineffective. It was a significant wake-up call for Springer, who probably didn't feel sufficiently challenged by his role over at the Jerry Springer Show, but was no longer deemed credible enough to hold down a more serious or intellectual role. Springer said that he wouldn't have done news reading if he wasn't able to provide his commentaries, and the commentaries presented at the end of the Springer show were becoming increasingly futile with mind to the antics that actually transpired during its runtime. The truth remained that news reading could no longer be Springer's way out, and after all the drama over at WMAQ, no network wanted to touch him with a 10-foot flagpole. Yet, while opportunity may have been narrowing in other lines of work, his own show was about to be handed the opportunity it had always been waiting for. While they were still under the thumb of multimedia and other associates, Springer was still actually pretty restrained in the content that was being produced. It was confrontational and aggressive, sure, but it was still fed through a filter that was designed to appease executives enough to the point where they wouldn't pull the plug on it entirely. After a couple transfers of power, though, the Jerry Springer show ultimately fell into the lap of Universal in 1996, who, unlike their predecessors, decided to give Dominic and Springer the green light for practically anything and everything they wanted to include in the show, which by the fall of 1997, they decided to put into action.
The truth of the matter is young people are much more open about their lives, much wilder, much crazier, whatever. And so then the show started to grow crazy. Then Universal bought us. And when Universal bought us, they said, from now on, you're only allowed to do crazy.
From here on out, while many other daytime talk shows were trying to refine their image in the face of mounting criticism, the Jerry Springer Show moved in the opposite direction, with subjects and conflicts that were only becoming increasingly far-fetched. On October 22nd, 1997, we were given the first taste of their new mantra with an episode titled Clanfrontation. What else can I really say to that? This broadcast squared off the Ku Klux Klan with the Jewish Defense League, who, if you can believe it, didn't see eye to eye on most issues, descending into unadulterated violence almost immediately. But this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. In 1993, the Jerry Springer Show encountered its first fight when an episode tastefully titled Black Panthers vs. White Races spiraled wildly out of control. At the time, the Jerry Springer Show distanced itself from the violence, with the producer commenting that it was not the sort of action they had invited. However, where many saw an incident, Dominic saw an opportunity. And with Universal giving him and Springer a blank check to do whatever they wanted, the rest of season 7 only descended further into chaos.
Today on Springer.
Hey, Matt, now look what you've done.
Candace and Nikki used to be friends.
You ain't no kind of woman if you mess with my man.
A jilted girlfriend fights back. Plus, Moon revealed the truth to her two boyfriends. But she's not through yet.
Moon, there's something you want to tell both of them?
Okay, guys.
Cheaters come clean and things get messy.
It's been a year. I'm ready to confront her.
Today on Springer.
Controversial subjects, angry audiences, unhinged guests, and a hands-off approach to whatever may have happened cultivated a hotbed for bloodshed and bedlam. The outrage from viewers offended by this content only continued to grow, with many begging networks to drop the show as they had done before, but the truth of the matter was that ratings spoke, and with the new era of the show being ushered in, Springer was hitting numbers that he had never seen before, both domestically and internationally, growing an audience who possessed a perverse interest in the insanity that the show wrought. A December 1997 article in the Winston-Salem Journal showed the many lenses that Springer viewers saw the show through, and although there are differences in how each person justified their enjoyment, the overarching theme was one of distance from the actual reality that the show portrayed, with some even going as far as to suggest it likely wasn't real. This wasn't an uncommon perspective at the time, particularly with the escalating hysterics and antics that the show was platforming. Audiences who did enjoy it needed a justification for that morbid curiosity that brought them in. As quickly as the moral outrage grew, so did the viewership, and controversies that would end most TV shows only boosted Jerry Springer further into the spotlight. The following year, an entire episode dedicated to a man marrying a horse was pulled for glorifying bestiality. And yes, the episode is just as ridiculous as it sounds.
I happened to be brushing down at her tail end, and she lifted her tail up, and
there it was in all its glory.
To be fair, I don't think this is the sort of content that would inspire someone to go out to the zoo and find their own personal soulmate, but it definitely highlighted America's obsession with creating their own human zoos and circuses, with Springer as their ringmaster. With Universal's oversight, the Jerry Springer Show indulged in everything that they were told to tone down before, and they were experiencing unforeseen success thanks to it, even as Jerry Springer bled credibility among the same circles he once used to fraternize with, something that may have once given him reason to pause. He doubled down on the trash TV that had given him this reputation in the first place, and he was pulling the rest of America down with him. However, there were reasons why they may have been told to take it down a notch in the past. The release of one constraint might draw another if you're not careful, and that was something Springer likely knew more than anyone else. Jerry Springer was springing toward the new millennium with some of the best ratings he'd ever seen, going so far as to beat out Oprah in multiple cities and on multiple networks. Every setback was met with one step forward, and by this point, he felt that his show wasn't any worse than much of the content that people were being exposed to on a daily basis. He wrote a book called Ringmaster, and then featured in a film also called Ringmaster that attempted to satirize his style of content.
You ain't gotta worry about touching me. Gun my man. Don't touch my man. Oh, Chloe, stop.
I don't need to watch it to tell you it looks like a bad film, likely because you can't satirize something that already feels like satire. I hope Gerald collected that paycheck though, acquire the bag, my goat. Nevertheless, his attitude and responses were not enough for some, and with TV at the center of America's cultural discussion, Springer seemed to be a toxic beating heart. In March of 1998, the CEO of Canadian company Seagram, you know, the ones who make the ginger ale, was given the rather unappealing Silver Sewer Award from high-profile Senator Joe Lieberman, crediting the company's support of Jerry Springer contributing to, quote, the anything goes mentality that is permeating our culture and eviscerating our morality.
A group of critics, led by Senator Joseph Lieberman and former Education Secretary William Bennett, launched a media campaign against Jerry and his brand of trash TV. And the Chicago coalition led by Reverend Michael Flegger soon joined the assaults.
You better feel responsible.
We are saying in his show that when you get mad with somebody, when you disagree with somebody, when I'm angry with somebody, normal behavior is to pick up a chair or pull their hair or slap them in the face. When you do that day after day after day, and that is the normal response, you're saying to America, particularly the young people who they target that show toward, this is normal behavior. That's not normal behavior. Violence is not normal behavior.
Although Springer had his fans here and there in higher office, the antics were beginning to bother many others, particularly those in the local council who had to deal with Springer's fans and protesters alike. And with the show's histrionics only becoming more preposterous, some began to question Springer's legal culpability in engendering such an environment. By April, an escalating campaign led by religious leaders was gathering momentum quickly, the most prominent name being Michael Flegger, an experienced activist who regularly organized nationwide boycotts and campaigns against shows that he felt were ruining the country's moral fabric. And trust me, he's not an uncontroversial figure himself, but by the late 1990s, his connections had made him extremely powerful, and brands feared the potential financial ramifications that could occur if they didn't listen to dump Jerry Springer. That same month, Rolling Stone and a TV show by the name of Extra both dropped exposés on Springer, contesting that some of the guests were completely fake and some of the fights were completely staged. These claims were backed up by former guests, many of whom spoke to media outlets at the time and stated that each program was assigned a fight quota, and that guests were encouraged to fight behind the scenes to drive up ratings.
They wanted us to stick to the script that they pre-wrote for us.
So you were being brought on as pure actors?
Exactly.
Did you rehearse a fake fight, the two of you?
Oh yeah, what he had said was push them, choke them, flip them, whatever you guys want to do as far as wrestling. He goes, if you want to punch, make sure that the punch connects. Don't throw a punch and miss. He goes, because then it looks really fake.
This drew a lot of controversy at the time, as although people seemed to enjoy the provocative representation that Springer displayed on his show, they wanted it to be an authentic representation. Although the TV screen did create some distance between viewers and the action, much of the fighting could easily yield criminal cases. Assault is still a crime, guys. However, if it wasn't real, then Jerry Springer and his producers would have some questions to answer over how this was presented on TV and whether they'd need to acquire a city entertainment license to continue producing the content, which would probably undermine the veneer of reality that many found comfort in. Springer and co. had been supposedly duped before with fake guests, but they had always affirmed that they had no clue that this was the case and had even entered litigation against those who had trolled them prior. Yet, in spite of their responses, the evidence, the testimony, and general pressure from campaigners was all becoming too much. And a few hours before Extra's expose was due to drop, the Jerry Springer Show's local broadcast was dropped by WMAQ, citing the mountain of controversy facing the program.
It's watched primarily by people who get it. I find it very hard to believe that there is any significant number of human beings on this planet that watch our show and take it seriously.
Although Springer was quickly picked back up by a competing network, part of the deal to appease the mob was to commit to less on-screen violence, which was a message that Springer's studio was quick to share. Although this was met with disappointment from some fans who questioned whether it'd even be worth watching. Other viewers hoped that it was just a ruse to take the activists off their backs. After all, it wasn't like they were committing to less nudity, or less swearing, or less anything else at that. Many hoped that this was still going to be the same trash that they always knew, and to be honest, they weren't entirely wrong. Around the same time, Springer released a statement expressing shock at why anyone involved with the production of his show would ever say that he had no intention to cease the on-air violence. And not too long after, it was revealed that actually Universal were still going to allow Springer to do fights as long as they were toned down. Springer was looking for the sort of highbrow, tasteful fights that you'd watch with a glass of wine and a charcuterie platter, of course. But I think you could guess what happened next.
Let's hear what she has to say. Here is your former best friend, Kim.
The fighting did not stop. They added a few more security measures, sure, but otherwise it was business as usual for Springer, who knew the way to the heart of his devoted viewers. Adversaries like Reverend Flagger were only further incensed by this, and having their complaints unheard by network executives took their problems all the way up to the FCC. Although the FCC never acted on Springer, Flagger did bring the antics to the attention of the city council, and Springer was called to Chicago City Hall to answer questions surrounding the integrity and realism of his show. 10 days before, his studio had once again committed to cutting out the violence, though Springer seems about as convinced by this commitment as last time.
Every single question you asked, you can get the answer if you're really interested in having the answer. If you're interested in making a show here and just trying to beat up our show, that's fine. But you know you can get those answers, don't you? Don't you know that you can find out who has that lease, sir? You don't have to be asking me.
Frankly, Springer's appearance at the Chicago City Hall showed how transcendental of a media figure he had become at that point. The hearing was packed with both fans and opponents of the TV host, and it was hard not to say anything that wouldn't provoke a response from the crowds who had gathered to witness this clash of titans.
There are things I know a lot about, and there are things that are not my business. I can't imagine, Andy Griffith knew a lot about all the contracts and business arrangements of the Andy Griffith Show. I mean, I'm hired to be a host of a talk show. That's what I'm hired to do.
For Springer, this wasn't going to be hard work for him. He had already worked in politics and wasn't unfamiliar in dealing with his fair share of prickly individuals. He was snarky, dismissive, and most of the time not too revealing. The most information we would receive regarding the authenticity of such fights is Springer stating that although certain aspects are staged, an overwhelming majority of the fights are real, and that it's as much of a surprise to him as it is to everyone watching. However, he didn't think they were violent or arresting trustworthy, comparing them more to roughhousing than anything else. The overarching attitude that you can kind of take from Springer's interaction with the city council is that he doesn't really consider himself responsible for what happens on his show. It's called The Jerry Springer Show, but Springer seems to see the show as a way to hand over power to the people, and that power just so happens to often lead to physical confrontation.
I have said this so many times publicly. I think it's a silly, crazy, outrageous show. I think it's chewing gum. I think the world will be fine with it. The world will be fine without us. Without it, it's just a stupid show at times, and that's all it is. It's like, it's an hour. If you want to just talk to your friends, because every single one of you here has someone you deeply respect in your life that, if under oath, would have to admit that once in a while they'd watch the show.
Although his appearance was well received by fans and didn't lead to any immediate outcome, the Chicago City Council hearing definitely marked a turning point in how much liberty Springer would be granted on his show going forward. And with the show's commitment to tone down the violence, there was a sense that this might be the end of Springer's golden age. To him, this was anything but fair. Springer doesn't consider himself to be an inflammatory figure. These people request to be on TV. The audience chooses to turn up to the studio. The subjects are whatever matters to them. Springer just asks a few questions and delivers a little monologue at the end of the show. That's not a crime, is it? It's a don't shoot the messenger narrative that pervades his appearance and continued responses to his numerous critics. Whereas other talk show hosts possess provocative attitudes that may have led to certain controversies, Jerry Springer was a comparably mild individual who just so happened to find himself in the crossfire amongst some of the most aggressively outrageous guests you'd ever seen. But as we headed into the 2000s, this was a defense that would be put to the test with a scandal bigger than anything we've covered so far.
Are you really taking the violence out, or?
Yeah, no. Yeah, we are. I mean, the people still get angry and go at each other, but we have a lot more security people there now, so they don't actually get to each other.
After the scrutiny the Springer's show drew from years 1997 to 1999, he and his producers had a little option but to promise at least some form of mediation for the interactions they supervised. There were questions over whether his studio's repeated requests for diplomacy would cause Springer to seek out a network that would be more likely to greenlight the antics that drove his show's rating to new heights. But Springer stayed on. Maybe part of him even welcomed a little serenity. With the new season of Springer on the horizon, although controversy was a guarantee, with the new conditions imposed on the show, people weren't exactly sure what they were going to see. However, before the next season could even begin, the show found itself at the center of something else entirely. Something that had ended careers and could very well end this one. Unfortunately, there is no real video material available, so I'm gonna be using secondhand accounts of what exactly happened.
That night I felt so sick that I couldn't even stand it. I actually committed adultery.
This is Ralph J. Panitz, a German painting contractor who, in 1997, married a lady by the name of Nancy Campbell. They had met online, with his username being Plainwell and hers being Cupcake99. However, in a time where the perils of e-dating was not so properly documented, their marriage quickly began to unravel. And in 1999, they divorced after filing multiple restraining orders against each other, often backed up by allegations of domestic violence. This legal exchange continued into 2000, when they decided that the best way to resolve their conflict was to go on The Jerry Springer Show. Ralph informed Nancy that their appearance would be one of reconciliation, and she agreed with the hope that they could finally work through their differences. After all, she still loved him. However, there was one more twist that Nancy was not aware of. Panitz had already secretly remarried a person by the name of Eleanor. This was news to Nancy, and to add insult to injury, Ralph declares on the show that he actually doesn't want Nancy to see him anymore. And to add further insult, this all happened on her birthday. It's hard to say exactly how the show went down, given the fairly vague accounts of it all, but it's reported that Ralph's new wife and the audience alike were particularly hostile to Nancy, who was framed throughout the show as someone who was still obsessed with her ex-husband, despite the fact that material evidence implied that Ralph had behaved far worse. Springer took to delivering the news that Ralph just didn't want to see Nancy anymore, and that she would just have to suck it up, with Nancy storming off the stage. And I mean, based on that account, who can blame her? In spite of the narrative spun on the Jerry Springer episode, reports indicate that actually Ralph was still regularly in contact with Nancy, and was having his own issues with Eleanor, who was also joining the legal love triangle against both other parties. By this point, Ralph had both filed for divorce from Eleanor, but also moved her into the house he had just bought with Nancy, though Nancy would subsequently be granted sole possession of it, filing an injunction against her ex-husband in the days running up to the Springer episode going live. But on the July night that it aired, police officers would find the unresponsive body of Nancy Campbell inside her new home, the Panitzes having disappeared completely. It didn't take long for investigators to piece together a timeline of events, that after losing possession of the house, Ralph and Eleanor had stopped by Nancy's property under the guise of collecting possessions. However, a fight soon broke out, and it was thought that Ralph Panitz had murdered Nancy Campbell. Ralph was arrested and charged, and then 2 years later he was convicted of second-degree murder. However, the looming presence of the Jerry Springer Show throughout proceedings left questions as to the show's involvement in facilitating an environment that led to the murder. The Jerry Springer Show made a statement shortly after her death lamenting the tragedy, and experts at the time didn't seem to view Springer as individually culpable for Nancy's death. However, they also didn't exactly sing their praises for Springer's staging and the show's framing of the situation, which was far too generous to someone who had almost certainly used and abused their partner for personal gain, not to mention that he murdered her. When the judge delivered the sentence, she called out Springer and his team for manipulating the guests and humiliating the victim. It showed a face of Springer's show that was seldom given enough attention. The question of how accurate he was in depicting the people at the center of his stories and the implications that carries. More on that later, but in spite of the fact that many believed Springer didn't seem to bear direct responsibility for Nancy Campbell's death, her sons disagreed, and after the conviction of Ralph Panitz, filed a lawsuit against the Jerry Springer Show, stating they had engineered an environment that precipitated the murder that followed a few months after. Nancy's sons accused the producers of encouraging Ralph to lie to his wife to bring her onto the show and neglecting to do any proper background checks that might actually give them context on the nature of their troubled relationship, which would have allowed them to handle the situation in a way that didn't lead to the escalation that followed. It's also worth noting that this was not the first time a case regarding the death of a tabloid talk show guest had gone to court. Just a few months prior, the Jenny Jones Show settled a case for $25 million with the family of Scott Amador, a gay man who was murdered by his friend Jonathan Schmitz after he confessed his love for him on Jones's talk show. Schmitz was noted to be highly mentally unstable, and also stated that the show's producers had implied that his secret admirer would be a woman. A jury trial found Jones's show to be liable and awarded Amador's family nearly $30 million. At the time, Jerry Springer and his team denied any involvement in Nancy's murder, emphasizing that it had occurred months after her actual appearance and the relationship between the episode and her death couldn't be established. In fact, Springer's lawyers stated that they would be countersuing for malicious prosecution. The time between the taping and the murder did add a degree of uncertainty not present in prior cases. However, the ace in the hole was the fact that the murder had occurred on the exact day that the episode was airing, and Nancy's sons alleged that, paired with the dispossession of the house, this aggravated Ralph to a point where he was capable of committing murder. For a while, it looked like this would be another case that would go to trial. However, in October of 2002, a court of appeals overturned the ruling against Jenny Jones, making a victory for the Campbells look increasingly unlikely, and in January of the following year, the case was dropped entirely. Springer and team were let off the hook, and Springer's lawyers announced they would also refrain from countersuing, which was just so nice of them.
Here is your mom, Sheila.
To bring me in front of these people and tell me that I'm some kind of low-life whore that don't care nothing about me.
What the hell gives you the right to put me through the I've had to go through?
Because you're my daughter!
Springer had prevailed. The Jerry Springer Show would continue on, undefeated by those who fought to see its demise. Yet, unlike many of his contemporaries, for Jerry Springer, there was a cost. He was the king of trash TV and so much more. Jerry Springer has taken his self-titled show to places that went beyond most people's wildest imaginations. Yet for him, it was never the end game.
Springer says he's only planning on doing the show for another 5 years. After that, who knows? He never intended to host a talk show. It was simply offered to him.
There are millions of people that could do the job better than I do on this silly show. I mean, I have no particular talent at this at all. I mean, people that, compare me to Oprah is the silliest thing in the world. She's a real talent. I mean, that's, she's got some substance in this business.
Although he had stated in the past that he didn't have any interest in returning to politics, by the 21st century, Springer was once again considering the possibility of a statewide Senate run. See, going into the 2000s, it was becoming increasingly common for celebrities of whatever persuasion to run for elected office. If Ronald Reagan's acting background seemed like a stretch for some, imagine pro wrestler Jesse Ventura being elected governor of Minnesota. Springer himself wasn't unknown to the wrestling community and probably saw this shift as his opportunity to re-enter the political sphere. He had briefly flirted with a run in 2000, but had decided to put it off a little longer given the drama engulfing his show at the time. Not unlike another TV host whose electoral prospects were promptly thwarted at the turn of the century. Wonder whatever happened to him. By 2003, though, the energy surrounding the Jerry Springer show had mellowed significantly. With the court case settled, Jerry had some time on his hands to dedicate to another pastime. And what better pastime than his old flame of politics. The upcoming 2004 election was bound to provide some options for Springer, as all seats in the House were up for grabs and gubernatorial roles were opening up all over the country. However, the post that Springer decided to set his heart on was one very close to home, the Ohio Senate seat.
Bill Clinton always wanted to win Virginia. He came within 4 points one time, 2 points another time, but they always keep moving the football. And the Democrats, I think rather wisely decided, let's not spend a lot of money and time. Let's focus on Ohio and Florida, and that's why those states are deadlocked tonight.
The Ohio Senate seat up for election in 2004 was held by Republican George Voinovich, another former mayor, but who had also served as governor, lieutenant governor, and as a member of the Ohio House of Representatives. In this era of bombastic personalities like George W. Bush, Voinovich was a shy, softly spoken figure, and pretty much the opposite of the sort of politician that Springer was. This seemed like a good target for someone like Jerry, who already had a higher profile than his presumptive Republican opponent, and at the end of January 2003, less than a month after his court case with the Campbells was settled, he began looking into the possibility of running. And on one hand, it wasn't hard to see how this could work out for him. Unlike his gubernatorial run in 1982, Springer would have the benefits of being a household name this time around. And although he had plenty of people who opposed him, he also had plenty of viewers who would likely turn out for their favorite daytime television host. Not to mention, the Ohio Democrats were reported to be financially struggling at the time, and Springer was willing to sink his own money into a concerted campaign. He began traveling throughout the state to gauge people's approval of him and what he stood for, with a website being launched to support his candidacy. Then, in July, Springer announced that he would be formally exploring options. He filed papers to run and aired a 30-minute infomercial with the purpose of fundraising for his campaign shortly after. The public was on the edge of their seats. Was this really happening? Was it really Jerry Springer for the United States Senate? Well, no, actually. The following month, Springer announced that he would withdraw from the race, citing the failure to set himself apart from his TV show. In spite of the fact that it wasn't drawing the same degree of media attention that it once was, it had still left a bitter taste in many people's mouths. And even some people who considered themselves casual viewers of the show felt dirty lending any political credence to the poster boy of trash TV. This wasn't helped by the fact that George Voinovich's low profile was actually pretty refreshing for a lot of Ohioans, and that he seemed to be fairly popular and successful in his role as senator. He was what many described as a moderate Republican from a time when such a thing wasn't considered so much of an oxymoron. Voinovich won the state the following year, carrying every single county in Ohio and embarrassing the Democratic Party. In a way, Voinovich represented wanted everything a person like Jerry Springer could have been, but had rejected in the pursuit of a media career. The strange thing is that I think Springer's desire to be a media figure was meant to be a precursor to his return to politics, and that he believed that regardless of how controversial his media was, that people would eventually listen to what he was saying and give him a chance. I really can't emphasize enough, Jerry Springer took 7 months to work out that people didn't like him. A February 2003 statewide poll of him found that 71% of the Ohio public possessed an unfavorable opinion of him. 71%! And this guy still thought he had a chance for so long. That was a figure he was never going to turn around in a single election cycle, let alone multiple election cycles. Much like his attempt in 1998 to return to the news, this was yet another wake-up call that people do in fact judge you by the media you produce. And if Springer wanted to actually use his profile for good, he would have to work harder to distance himself from the show that gave him that power in the first place. Or he could just choose the second option, accept your fate. Over the next few years, Springer began to take even more shots at his own show, embracing his reputation as one of America's most hated television hosts. Springer never felt a connection to the content he created, but by now, as it had finally dawned on him that this was what he was going to be saddled with for the unforeseeable future, he decided that he didn't need to hide his contempt any longer for the work he produced. On one hand, it felt like a humorous form of self-deprecation. He'd slide down on a fire pole, there'd be trip gongs every time the gloves came off, contentious Jerry chants. This is the era where the show really felt like it became rather fake for the entertainment factor, and Jerry seemed to be having a good time leaning into this humor. But on the other, you couldn't help but feel like it was the bitter complaints of someone trapped in a career that gave them all the resources he needed, but absolutely nothing to do with them, because nobody could ever take him seriously. From 2005 to 2006, Springer briefly hosted a radio show which focused more on political affairs, but again stepped away from it because of, quote, other commitments. See, every time a new contract landed on his desk, Springer signed it. Every time a new season came around, Springer was there to promote it. And every time a guest kicked off, Springer was there to revel in it. He still had his showbiz career and was never in short supply of gigs there, even picking up a couple seasons hosting America's Got Talent. In fact, as he moved into the back end of his career, he only accelerated his TV appearances, with multiple guest spots on both sides of the pond and never turning down an opportunity to flex his political chops.
But number two is he has a great skill in business and in marketing. Great skill. I would disagree with him. I believe that just because you're good in business is a totally different skill than being a political leader. Because when you're in business, there's only one line you look at, the bottom line. Are you making a profit or are you not? You do whatever you can to make a profit. When you're dealing in political matters, in governmental matters, it's not a matter of profit. You're providing a service, and oftentimes it's not possible to put a number on it, to quantify it. You have to provide services, and you have to be able to deal with nuance. You have to be able to deal with the people.
The Jerry Springer Show continued to run over the years, never really reaching the rating highs or the moral lows that it once did, but maintaining a consistent audience who, by now, had been desensitized to what was once shocking content. There was plenty worth objecting to, and still the occasional controversy, but once a cultural phenomenon like the Jerry Springer Show had been running for over a decade, there's nothing else for anyone to really say to it. In 2008, producer Richard Dominic finally left, being replaced by the wife of Steve Wilkos, who also worked in production. Despite Dominic's influence, I don't think many people would have noticed much change when he left.
The problem is, lied to me, just woman after woman.
What do you mean
I come out
you?
with the intention
How
that I'm going to do the right
I never
thing.
led you on.
You did.
How?
You did.
Please explain.
That's not even the point that you being a man. It's the
man,
point that you...
From there, Jerry Springer's show continued all the way up until 2018, when NBC Universal ordered the production of the show be halted. The reason for why it was halted was never actually revealed, but people have their theories, from the ratings not being what they once were, to the attitude towards such shows shifting, to the possibility that maybe Springer had enough himself. After all, Jerry was still a hot product, and was quickly given a new contract to put his legal background to use in the very originally named TV show Judge Jerry, which I feel was just a show designed to confuse people into clicking on it. Springer was very enthusiastic about the concept and thought it would give him an opportunity to do something more mature, but something about the show just didn't quite land with audiences the way his self-titled show had.
What happened at the gas station? That's all I want to hear right now.
So when we get there, you know, she get out the car and she going to the gas station. So I'm in the car by myself. I'm vibing. I'm listening to my music.
You're vibing.
Yeah, I'm vibing. I'm listening to my music and I'm scrolling on Facebook on my phone.
We are just alike.
Yeah, right. So remind you, I'm the only car at this gas station. We
You don't look like a car.
I was actually in a truck.
Despite the attempt to try and introduce some original ideas and colorful characters, the show felt like a rather pale imitation of other courtroom reality shows, with Jerry Springer cut and pasted into the picture. It was apparent that whatever charisma he once possessed was not really on display anymore, and after 3 seasons, this program was dropped as well, with Springer's presence clearly not being able to draw the same views as before. It was a reminder for how Springer, regardless of his fandom, was still only as good as his guests, and a courtroom environment which would inherently demand more discipline was naturally going to neuter some of that chaotic energy that so many people watched the Jerry Springer show for.
The argument when our shows started coming on the air wasn't that, oh my gosh, I didn't know behavior like this existed. It was that we weren't used to seeing anyone on television unless they were upper middle class whites.
He remained active on social media, even making the occasional appearances to discuss his legacy. One commonly quoted interview has him expressing a bit more remorse on what he created. I guess hindsight is always 20/20.
Do you crown yourself the granddaddy of reality TV?
No, I just apologize. Yeah, I'm so sorry. What have I done? I've ruined the culture. I just hope hell isn't that hot because I burn real easy. I'm very light complected, and that kind of worries me. No, I'm just a schlub who got lucky.
He continued to be active in celebrity circles, and his YouTube channel continued to upload old clips of the show. And in 2023, it looked like he was working on something new, with a TikTok on March 10th appearing to show him on set. Unfortunately, though, we would never find out too much about this new project, as less than 2 months later, on April 27th, 2023, Jerry Springer died, aged 79. Tributes and think pieces on his legacy flowed in. A man who had changed the face of TV for better and worse had passed away. But for a person who had evoked such strong reactions during his tenure on his self-titled show, the coverage of his death was strangely dispassionate. And yeah, I know, you're probably not going to have the public celebrating the death of most people, but it was a representation of how, for all his contributions to the culture, people didn't really view the contributions as entirely his on a personal level. That for nearly 30 years, Springer had sunk his time and energy into a show that would only really bear his name. The rest of him might as well be forgotten, right? In a way, it can't be a surprise that this is the way that people view Springer. After all, it's the way Springer viewed the show himself. He never really perceived himself as an ambassador for the program. Hell, he didn't even watch it. But how should we view Springer when the story has so many more sides?
Does your show, does television generally have any effect, any real lasting effect on the world today? Your show or television generally have any effect, good or bad, do you think?
No, my show is plain stupid.
I guess the allotted time has passed between which a person dies to the point where we can start actually trying to work out what they or their show stood for. Recently, a Jerry Springer documentary on Netflix was released. It was promoted as this big, all-revealing piece on what actually happened behind the scenes, yet it ended up being shockingly tame, focusing primarily on the producers like Dominic, who are happy to make excuses for the show's handling without providing any real insight. More importantly, the documentary fails to actually talk in real depth about the man who the show was named after, whose position is often greatly overlooked, when I think it might be the most interesting aspect of the show. I hate to say it, but I think this sort of documentary would have benefited from Jerry's presence, and unfortunately, we will never have that opportunity now.
The probability of paternity is calculated to be 0%. It's not, Julian. Why are you not off that chair getting to your son to talk to him? Why are you sat here still blaming everybody but yourself? Because I'm going, but you're not, are you? Selfish mare.
There are plenty of TV show hosts who are seen as shameless provocateurs, some who are even perceived as frauds, particularly when we reflect back on the trash TV era. Dr. Phil literally went and provided a brazen endorsement of Donald Trump in the run-up to the last election, before claiming a few days later that actually he had written the same exact speech for Kamala Harris.
Were you surprised by the way people latched on to you being there as if it was an obvious endorsement?
Well, look, I'm at a Trump rally.
These are people with a blatant lack of moral compass, and to be honest, it feels like that's what you need to make trash TV succeed. It's hard to really spend too much time debating the ethics of these sorts of shows when there really are none. I know that people like Springer and Jones were let off by the courts, but it should be quite apparent that even if we took the most charitable perspective, these shows brought, in many cases, mentally unwell people on TV for emotionally torturous revelations, and regularly did not conduct any proper background checks to guarantee a fair perception of those involved. The producers can say whatever they want, but the human cost for entertainment value is too high in these scenarios, and you can see that whenever you switch on an episode of Springer. Outside of all the highly problematic subjects, which in hindsight seem exploitative and in bad taste to say the least, from the parading of mental illnesses to the blatant bigotry toward marginalized groups, the simple fact is that there will never be a justification for what the Jerry Springer Show put their guests through. Regardless of what they had done or who they were, many of them were individuals who had seen a life of suffering and deprivation only to have themselves strung up in a public theater, while the producers, the executives, and Jerry himself all grew rich off that same humiliation.
If government, any government, is to have any positive effect on our lives, which after all is its purpose, to make life more tolerable, then that government must bear some relationship to how we live.
Jerry Springer was born into a family that had seen suffering greater than most of us could ever imagine. He was a person who, at least throughout much of his earlier life, seemed intent to give back to the people, who wanted to make a positive difference in the world. I don't think those dreams ever subsided, but they were always offset by his own ambition, his desire to immediately possess power to make the change he desired, despite the fact that change is often a slow and painful process, laced with setbacks. As much as he loved being the biggest personality in local politics, Springer simply didn't have the patience for the parts of it that weren't as fun, so he set his sights on something different.
Good evening. We could be on the brink of another real estate boom in Ohio.
In his role as a commentator and newsreader, Springer again successfully made himself the center of attention and transformed ratings on the channel that hired him. He was liked and respected by many, even if his methods were viewed as unorthodox and unprofessional by others. Viewers felt they understood Jerry Springer at one point, that he was one part serious politician and one part bombastic entertainer, a combination that seemed to drive up his popularity in the 90s and inspired network executives to give him his own self-titled TV show.
What do you think about blacks?
There's nothing wrong with them, but you shouldn't race mix.
But you wouldn't kill them?
No. Kill Jews? You just send them back to Africa.
Many retrospectives these days seem to harp on the fact that the early show dealt with serious matters, and yet all the archival evidence from around that time, it tells you an entirely different story.
You're not stating facts.
Well, the point is,
hey, you let that come out of your mouth one more time, you will have.
The truth was that many fans of Springer thought he was going too tabloid with the subjects he covered. The serious topics that are commonly referenced were often sprinkled amongst many other lowbrow subjects that have been mostly forgotten. It's actually completely possible that Springer had the opportunity to be a hard-hitting political journalist. After all, he did say that serious topics pulled strong ratings. This is important information because understanding this fact alters the perception of the 1994 decision to revamp the show, that it wasn't a complete overhaul, it was just a step further into absurdity, one that Springer didn't actually have to do. We're not talking about a down-on-his-luck TV host pulling out a last-ditch attempt to rescue his TV show. We're talking about one of the most successful, multi-talented media figures of his era. But he was so out of his depth in the genre that he just went along with it until he was in too deep. The further the Jerry Springer show went, the more it had less of his personal influence, and more just became a showcase for other people to ruin each other's lives. And that's where we arrive at the moral dilemma of Jerry Springer, the one that has underpinned his entire legacy. In an industry of people who never seemed that concerned by morality, why did Springer, who actually did, go the furthest of any TV host in history? Was there anything really Jerry Springer about the Jerry Springer show?
If there's any way to defend the ridiculousness of our show, the reason I defend it is because I find that most of the criticism is based on the view that if you show lower income people on television, somehow that's trash. And wealthy people or celebrities can talk about the exact same issues, and we can't get enough of it.
Springer's defense commonly boiled down to this just being a slice of America, that plenty of celebrities and officials had done worse and been alright in the end, that Springer was simply giving people an opportunity to tell their own story in a world where stories only belonged to the rich and famous. This was the First Amendment, clear as day. It definitely calls back to his own personal scandal and how quickly he was accepted back into high society after he embraced his transgressions. And I do think that part of the issue did come down to his critics. These critics always attacked the show on the basis that it glorified the subjects, but I don't really think it ever did, and that led to Springer making a case for the show that wasn't entirely invalid. I think his own liberal values do come into play here because a lot of the campaigning did come from traditionally conservative sources and narratives, and I think while other talk show hosts caved with the intent of being more tasteful, it gave Springer a natural inclination to resist because there was this elitist attitude toward his content. And I don't think the issue is that the show was vulgar or crass just from people sharing their stories. The real problem was that the Jerry Springer show didn't really allow people to tell their own story, the story that had already been planned prior to many of these people stepping onto that stage. One detail that repeatedly stood out to me so much was how Nancy Campbell was the person who clearly had been wronged in the run-up to her appearance on the Springer show. Even if we cast aside the abuse allegations, which we shouldn't, even if we cast aside the claims that the show's producers attempted to blackmail her, which we shouldn't, her ex-husband still gave her the impression that she would be appearing on the show to reconcile her relationship, and that this lie was almost certainly encouraged by the producers. Other allegations detailed them sleeping together on the night before her appearance, building up an emotional connection which would then lead to the explosive disconnect that followed, and the continuing conflict that would lead to her death. I can't say for certain whether Jerry Springer's show directly precipitated her death, but I do think it was a significant factor in the tension between them. I mean, how could it not be? It was one of the biggest TV shows in the world, and I don't think it was a coincidence that Ralph Panitz murdered her on the night of it airing. I also think that even if there was no connection at all, a TV show had the opportunity to possibly intervene in an abusive relationship, but turned it into TV fodder instead, and that is indefensible. Just learning about this situation alone should make everyone wonder how many similar cases there were that didn't lead to murder, but probably really fucked up a lot of people's lives. I know there were a lot of allegations that the show was fake and many of the situations were staged, but I can't say I entirely agree. I don't think that many of them were fake, but I do think they were engineered. I do think guests were manipulated, and I do think that violence was encouraged. People looking to fake something for their 15 minutes of fame would have found it fairly easy, because the producers definitely lapped it up, but it only took one story to be true for there to be catastrophic consequences. How much Jerry Springer knew about the show behind the scenes has always been a subject of debate. Springer has long contested that the only information he was typically given was a summary on the card he read at the start of the show, that practically everything else was down to the team around him, and maybe that was true to an extent, and that a lot of the time he was probably preoccupied with defending the show from the detractors. However, I think there comes a point when you look around and you look at what's happening and realize that this isn't healthy, and it's very much hard to believe that someone like Springer, an observant and intelligent individual who started his career advocating for the poor and impoverished, wouldn't have been able to see that. I think he was very aware that everything was not as it seemed, and that he wouldn't have to look far to find his critics. However, he thought that the popularity of the show would position him to improve his image over time, and eventually put himself back into a role with credibility. The only thing about the Jerry Springer show that was unabashedly Springer was the desire for public attention at whatever cost. It was something that he seemed to want to use as a springboard into other careers, not dissimilar to how he acted in the past, but whereas in the past, his own conduct and personality created a representation of himself, now the actual show created a representation of Springer, one where he was mostly in the backseat to other people's antics. He could have pursued a show that would allow him to broadcast his personality with more challenging political conversations, but he turned that down in favor of something that he had no real connection to, and that created Springer's own delusion of separation. I believe that he never really viewed the Jerry Springer show as the quote-unquote Jerry Springer show past 1994, that he was always just another cast member, and he could change lenses whenever he wanted, that this was just another gig. But he neglected to consider that just because people watched him didn't mean that people wanted him, and just because he could separate himself from the show didn't mean anyone else could, regardless of how hard he tried. This misapprehension was first demonstrated through his attempts to return to news reading, and you could see how genuinely angered and hurt he was that other anchors took offense to his presence, representing their perfectly reasonable protests over a questionable hiring as an infringement on free speech. He thought people wanted him, but his presence tanked ratings, and there was nothing he could do to recover that. This was again demonstrated in 2003, when he took 7 months to work out that people from his home state just didn't like him very much. It was clearly something for Springer to process, as his brand of populism always relied on being liked. The truth was that although Springer didn't view himself through the lens of the Jerry Springer show, everyone else did, and maybe they were right to do so. Maybe Springer would have been a good politician who used his wealth and influence for positive purposes, but unfortunately we never got to find out, since his gains were often too ill-gotten to ever be attractive to anyone. Do I think that driving forces like Dominic were far more instrumental in directing the show down its increasingly depraved and violent path? Without a doubt. They admit it, and they're proud of it. At the same time, though, the maxim that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing rings truer now than ever. And although you can't necessarily be surprised that a Democratic politician is once again the subject of this quote, it is disappointing that it was for someone like Springer, a person with many talents and many options, who ended up using those talents for purposes that only served to hurt the people he once wanted to advocate for.
Sorry for you, I'm asking the question. Do you feel that it might have hampered your ambition? I mean, you would obviously, like any politician, you would seek high office.
Well, I might one day do that.
Do you think so?
That's a possibility,
Well,
yeah.
and how do we define high office in your situation?
Governor, Senate, something like that. That's a possibility, and it's, I've thought about it.
I think if Jerry Springer read his obituaries, he'd be disappointed too. He wasted his life trying to escape a cycle that he couldn't help but perpetuate, and in the end, he's remembered more for what he let happen rather than anything he actually did. His ruminations on his show's legacy says it all. Rather than ever being a heartfelt defense, more seems like a resignation to what he caused. The fact that he was part of the problem, that ultimately, regardless of what the show did for his pockets, the memory left behind will be one of suffering over entertainment. People will find new forms of TV to keep themselves occupied, and the Jerry Springer Show will fade out of the public consciousness, but some will never recover from their brief appearances on a show that pretended to care for them, but only cared for the circus that it would create for a braying crowd, one that seemed all too familiar. At the start of this video, I spoke about gladiatorial combat and the brutal entertainment that many Romans gladly indulged in whatever the human cost. In the 21st century, there is the sense that for all we think we've progressed from such ancient traditions, when the opportunity to switch on the TV to watch some people we have no emotional connection to descend into violence, many can't help but tune in still. The Jerry Springer Show tapped into that, and it's no surprise that the most violent episodes also drew the highest ratings. Springer said he thought the show's guests represented that slice of everybody, but I'd say Jerry Springer was a more accurate representation of who we are. The fact that many of us can't help but rubberneck a car crash seems to me like the inconvenient truth that made people uncomfortable with the otherwise esteemed host. The fact that Jerry Springer was not watched by the sort of people it often portrayed, but people like you and I, and that his failure in every other field after the success of his self-titled show was because even the people who liked him rejected him because he was a representation of many of us that we just didn't want to acknowledge, one that has never really gone away.
You could have had a talk show 2,000 years ago if we had had television. People have always been talking about what their neighbors are doing, what's going on in their own lives. It used to be you would gather in the town square, in the marketplace, and you talk about what was going on in the next village or what your neighbors were doing, and you'd gossip about that, and you'd be amazed about that. If we have television 2,000 years from now, we'll still have talk shows.
Although the Jerry Springer Show eventually met its demise, we'll almost certainly experience another incarnation of this at some point. Somewhere right now, people are watching a random person break down on social media, or they're watching a brawl posted on TikTok or Instagram Reels, or they're watching a commentary video on some fallen public figure. We'll tell ourselves that these people are making the conscious choice to be a part of this, and that the consequences in the court of public opinion that follow are ones of their own making.
And on that note, take care of yourself and each other.
But I think that's what Jerry told himself too.
His road to fame took him from mayor of Cincinnati to local news anchor to public access song stylist.
Well, I'm busted flat in Baton Rouge and I'm waiting for that train, and I'm feeling nearly faded as my jeans. Bobby thumbed the diesel down while waiting for that train that took us all the way.
The band could only find one key for him to sing in. Off key.
And feeling good was easy, Lord, when Bobby sang the blues. Feeling good was good enough for me. Good enough for me and my Bobby McGee.